The stone floor was a thief. It stole the warmth from her bare feet, from the thin wool of her shift, from the very marrow of her bones. Colum pressed her back against the damp wall of the holding cell, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear into the cracks between the stones. It never worked. She was one of 20. 20 unclaimed she-wolves, herded like livestock into the capital for the annual choosing. Some were young, faces still round with the last of their girlhood. Others were older, eyes hard with the bitterness of being passed over year after year. Colum was somewhere in the middle, old enough to have no hope, young enough to still feel the sting of it. A cough rattled from the corner, wet and heavy. A girl named Rilla was sick, her fever a palpable heat in the chilled air. No one went near her. Sickness was a flaw. Flaws meant you were worthless. Colum knew all about being worthless. Her worthlessness was a brand, not on her skin, but deeper. It was in the way her own pack had cast her out, in the hunger that had gnawed at her belly for a year, in the shame that burned behind her eyes as the traitors had looked her over, their gazes lingering on her thin frame, her plain face, her utter lack of any remarkable quality. She was forgettable. That had been her only survival tool until now. Now they wanted someone unforgettable. Whispers slithered through the cell, thin and sharp as needles. They spoke of him, the Alpha King, King Theron. "They say he hasn't smiled in 100 years," one girl breathed, her voice trembling. "They say his wolf is a demon," another added, pulling her knees to her chest. "That it tore out the throat of the last woman who displeased him." "It's not a demon," a sharp-faced woman corrected, her tone laced with scornful authority. "It's possessed. Cursed. It doesn't answer to him anymore. That's why he needs a mate. A powerful one. To chain the beast." Colum shivered, a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. A king who couldn't control his own wolf. An alpha who was broken. The thought was more terrifying than any story of simple cruelty. It spoke of a power untethered, a rage without a mind to guide it. The heavy bar on the cell door scraped open. A guard with a face like a fist glared in at them. "On your feet. It's time." Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Colum's chest. She wanted to shrink back, to become one with the stone, but hands were grabbing her, pulling her into the shuffling line. They were prodded down a long, torch-lit corridor. The air grew warmer, thick with the scent of pine, beeswax, and the cloying smell of too many bodies packed into one space. The corridor opened into a vast hall, a cavernous space carved from the mountain's heart. Hundreds of wolves, the high-born and powerful of every pack in the kingdom, filled the tiered stone benches that rose on all sides. They were a sea of rich furs and glittering jewels, their faces a blur of judgment. At the center of the hall was a sunken circle of packed earth, the ring. Colum's breath hitched. This was it. One by one they would be led into that circle, to be inspected by the king. He would sit on his throne, and his monstrous wolf would judge them. The first girl, a beauty with hair like spun gold, was led into the ring. She walked with a practiced grace, her chin high. She stood before the throne and curtsied, a perfect, elegant motion. Colum couldn't see the king clearly from this distance, only a massive silhouette on a throne of dark, unadorned stone. A figure of shadow and dread. A low sound echoed in the sudden silence of the hall. It wasn't a growl. It was deeper, more resonant, a vibration that seemed to come from the stone itself. The golden-haired girl flinched, her composure cracking. She took an involuntary step back, a sharp command from the guard beside the throne. "Dismissed." The girl hurried away, her face burning with humiliation. Another was brought forward, and another. Each one was met with that same soul-shaking hum of displeasure. a vibration of pure, primal rejection. The king never moved. He never spoke. The beast inside him did all the talking. Column's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She didn't want to be chosen. She just wanted to survive this. To be dismissed, to be sent back to the kitchens or the laundry, to fade back into the invisibility that had kept her safe. The line shortened. The sick girl, Rilla, was shoved forward. She stumbled, catching herself before she fell. She stood in the ring, shivering, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The deep hum from the throne intensified, layered now with a distinct growl that made the hair on Column's arms stand on end. Rilla whimpered, tears tracking through the grime on her cheeks. She was dismissed with a flick of a guard's hand, her failure absolute. Column's turn. The guard's hand clamped onto her arm, his fingers digging into the bone. He shoved her forward. Move, Scrap. The world narrowed to the circle of dark earth. The scent was overwhelming here. Pine, cold stone, and something else. Something wild and dangerous, like ozone before a lightning strike. Her feet were numb as she walked to the center. She didn't dare look up. She stared at the ground, at the scuffs and footprints of the failures who had come before her. She was supposed to curtsy. She was supposed to present herself. Her body wouldn't obey. She just stood there, trembling, a pathetic offering of skin and bone. She waited for the growl. She waited for the dismissal that would seal her fate as refuse. Silence. The humming didn't start. The growl didn't come. The silence stretched, becoming a presence of its own, heavy and suffocating. 1,000 pairs of eyes were on her. She could feel their scorn, their confusion. Why was the beast silent for her? A ripple of movement from the throne. Column's head snapped up against her will. And she saw him. He was not a silhouette. He was a man. A king. Broader than any man she had ever seen, with a face carved from granite and glaciers. His hair was the black of a starless night. His eyes were the color of winter frost, pale and unnervingly still. He was beautiful in the way a blizzard was beautiful, vast, merciless, and utterly lethal. But it was what stood beside the throne that stole the air from her lungs. It was a wolf, but no wolf she had ever seen. It was enormous, a creature of shadow and rage given form, its fur the color of storm clouds. Its eyes burned with a malevolent silver light. This was his wolf, the possessed one. It was not inside him, it stood beside him, a separate spectral entity tethered to him by a shimmering cord of energy. It was looking at her. The spectral wolf took a step forward. A collective gasp swept the hall. The guards raised their spears. The creature had never moved from the king's side before. It let out a low, guttural snarl, not of displeasure, but of something else. Something Column couldn't name. It stalked toward her, its massive paws silent on the earth. The silver fire in its eyes intensified, and she felt a strange pull in her chest, a resonance with the beast's raw power. She should have been terrified. She was, but beneath the terror was something else, a flicker of recognition. The guards tensed, ready to intervene, but the king raised a single hand. A silent command to wait. His frosty eyes were locked on her, his expression unreadable. But she saw a flicker of something in their depths. Not coldness, not cruelty. Shock. The great wolf stopped a few feet from her. Its head was level with her own. The air crackled with its power, a physical pressure against her skin. It lowered its massive head, the silver fire in its eyes swirling. It stared at her, and for a moment she felt as if it were looking not at her, but into her, past the fear and the shame, into the hollowed-out space where her own spirit used to live. Then, it did the impossible. The spectral beast, the demon wolf that had terrified a kingdom for a decade, bent its powerful front legs. It lowered its head. It sank to the ground, its body prostrate on the dirt floor of the ring. It knelt. To her. The silence in the hall was absolute, a perfect, pristine void of disbelief. No one breathed, no one moved. The world had stopped turning. A voice, deep as thunder but soft as snowfall, cut through the stillness. It came from the throne. Her. Just one word. King Theron rose from his stone throne. He was a mountain moving. He descended the few steps into the ring, his gaze never leaving her face. The spectral wolf remained kneeling, its head bowed. He walked past the groveling beast and stopped directly in front of Colum. He was so close she could feel the chill that radiated from his body, a palpable cold that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and scarred. He didn't touch her. He simply hovered his hand over her cheek. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice a quiet rumble that vibrated through her bones. "Colum," she whispered, the sound stolen from her throat. "Colum," he repeated, tasting the name. His pale eyes searched hers, and the shock she'd seen before was now mingled with a desperate, hungry curiosity. "Why are you not afraid of him?" She looked past the king, at the kneeling shadow wolf. She didn't have an answer. I don't know." But that wasn't true. Looking at the beast, she didn't feel fear. She felt pity. A deep, aching sadness that seemed to well up from a place she didn't know she had. King Theron's eyes narrowed slightly, tracking her gaze. He saw it. He understood what she was feeling. A muscle feathered in his jaw. He let his hand fall and turned to face the stunned assembly. His voice boomed, carrying to every corner of the vast hall, an iron proclamation that shattered the silence into 1,000 pieces. "The choosing is over. I have found my queen." The journey to the king's private wing was a blur of stone corridors and disbelieving faces. The guards who flanked her now walked with a new, stiff deference. The whispers that followed her were no longer of scorn, but of awe and terror. She was the girl who had tamed the beast. She felt like a fraud. She hadn't done anything. She had just stood there. They left her in a chamber larger than any building she had ever been in. A fire roared in a hearth big enough to roast an ox. Furs and tapestries covered the walls, but they couldn't conceal the fundamental coldness of the place. It was a room built for a king, not a home. It was as beautiful and as lifeless as he was. Colum stood in the center of the room, still in her thin, dirty shift, feeling like a strayed dog brought into a palace. She wrapped her arms around herself, the memory of his chilling presence making her shiver more than the actual temperature. The great wooden doors opened, and he entered alone. The spectral wolf was gone. Without the beast beside him, he seemed both more and less terrifying. More a man, and yet the absence of that raw power made the coldness emanating from him seem more concentrated, more personal. "You are cold," he stated. It wasn't a question. She nodded, unable to speak. He walked to a large wardrobe and pulled out a heavy robe lined with what looked like black wolf fur. It was his. He held it out to her. She hesitated, her ingrained fear of overstepping, of taking what wasn't hers, holding her in place. His expression didn't change, but his voice softened almost imperceptibly. "It is yours. Everything here is yours now." Slowly she took it. The fur was impossibly soft, and the robe was heavy with a warmth that smelled faintly of him, pine and cold air and something metallic, like blood or steel. She wrapped it around herself, the hem pooling at her feet. It was like being swallowed by his shadow. "I don't understand," she finally managed, her voice small. "What happened in the ring?" Theron turned to the fire, watching the flames dance. "My wolf has been silent for a very long time. It has not answered my call. It has not shared its strength. It has existed as a shade, an echo of rage I could barely contain. He paused, his broad back a wall of tension. The pack elders call it a possession, a curse. They believe it is a sickness that will eventually consume me, and with me, the strength of the alpha line. He finally looked at her, his frosty eyes burning with an intensity that made her want to recoil. It has not knelt in a century, not for my father, not even for me, when I took the throne. Then why? For me? That is the question my entire kingdom is asking, he said. When you entered the ring, it woke up. I felt it. For the first time in 10 years, I felt it stir. It was not the usual cold rage, it was recognition. And when it knelt, he shook his head, a gesture of profound disbelief. It was not kneeling to you, it was submitting. It was acknowledging its queen. Her mind reeled. Queen. The word was absurd. She was Column. She was scrap. She was nobody. But I'm not. I have nothing. I'm not powerful. I'm not from a great line. I was sold to the traders because my pack had no use for me. Their blindness does not change what you are, he said, his voice firm, absolute. My wolf knows, even if you do not. He took a step closer, and the cold radiating from him intensified. It felt like standing near a block of ice. My wolf is dying, Column. Fading. And whatever you are the only thing that has reached it in a decade. You are its only hope. He stopped, his gaze dropping to the floor. And therefore, you are mine. The next few days were a lesson in dislocation. Column was given new clothes, soft wool and even softer leather. She was given food, hot and plentiful, served on plates she was afraid to touch. She was given a bed so large and soft, she felt lost in it. And she was given a constant, unnerving companion, Lord Marius. Marius was the king's chief advisor, an older wolf with a placid face and kind eyes. He was the one who explained the ways of the court, the names of the nobles, the duties she would be expected to perform. He was her guide in this terrifying new world, and his gentle demeanor was a balm against the fortress's oppressive chill. The king is not an easy man to know, Marius told her one afternoon as they walked along the battlements. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of snow from the higher peaks. The fading of his wolf has sealed him away. He feels everything, and yet nothing. It is a constant cold torment. He feels cold, Column said, pulling Theron's robe tighter around her. She wore it constantly. It was the only thing that felt real. Marius nodded, his expression sympathetic. Yes, a physical cold that no fire can warm. It is the life of his wolf draining away. He is the strongest alpha this land has ever known, but even a mountain can be worn down by ice. He smiled at her, a warm, reassuring expression. But you, my lady, you are the first sign of a thaw. You give us hope. She didn't feel like hope. She felt like a prisoner. Theron was a constant, distant presence. He watched her. At meals in the great hall, she would feel his frosty gaze on her from across the long table. In the library, where she sought refuge among the books, she would see him standing in the shadows of an archway. He never approached, never spoke more than a few clipped words. It was as if he, too, were waiting for something to happen, for her to perform the miracle his wolf had promised. The miracle never came. The spectral wolf did not reappear. Theron grew colder. The attack came without warning. Marius had suggested a ride down the mountain path to inspect a lower watchtower. It would be good for the people to see their future queen, he'd urged. Theron had agreed with a curt nod. They rode with only a small retinue of guards. The air was crisp, and for a moment, seeing the vast expanse of the forested valleys below, Column felt a flicker of something other than fear. The ambush was brutally efficient. Arrows flew from the trees. Men in rough leather, bearing the markings of no known pack, swarmed the path. They were wild rogues, driven by desperation. The guards fought bravely, but they were outnumbered. Theron moved like a tempest. He dismounted, a great sword appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. He was no longer a cold, still king. He was a whirlwind of death. Every swing of his blade was a killing blow, but there were too many. An arrow thudded into his shoulder. He grunted, stumbling, but didn't fall. Another rogue charged him from behind. "King Theron!" Colum screamed, her voice raw with terror. He turned, but he was too slow. The rogue's axe was already swinging. Colum, acting on pure instinct, grabbed a fallen guard's short sword from the ground. It was heavy and awkward in her hand. She didn't know how to fight, but she threw herself in front of Theron, holding the blade up in a clumsy two-handed block. The axe crashed down. The impact jarred her to the teeth, the force of it throwing her backward into Theron's chest. The sword was torn from her grasp. She was defenseless. The rogue grinned, his teeth yellow, and raised his axe for the final blow. A black shape blurred past her. Theron, ignoring the arrow in his shoulder, drove his own blade through the rogue's chest. He didn't stop. He pushed Colum behind him, planting himself like a monolith between her and the world, and continued to fight. They survived. Barely. By the time reinforcements arrived from the fortress, summoned by a horn blast from the one surviving guard, the path was littered with bodies. They hid that night in a small cave off the path, waiting for the way to be fully secured. The remaining guards stood watch outside. Inside, it was just her and Theron. He had torn the arrow from his shoulder himself, his face a mask of stone, though she had seen the flicker of agony in his eyes. She was shaking, the adrenaline of the fight leaving her cold and nauseous. He sat across the small fire they'd built, his gaze fixed on her. The silence was thick with unspoken things. "You tried to save me," he said, his voice rough. You were going to be hit. You would have died." "I didn't think," she admitted, staring at her trembling hands. "I just moved." He was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. He looked different here, away from the trappings of his throne. The granite lines of his face seemed softer, the icy wall around him fractured by exhaustion and pain. "No one has ever done that," he said, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "No one has ever stood between me and a blade." She looked up at him. The king, the alpha of alphas, the most powerful wolf in the world, looked lost. "They fear you," she whispered. "And you do not?" "I do," she said honestly. "But when I saw that axe swinging, it wasn't fear I felt. It was the same strange, aching pang she'd felt for his wolf. The thought of this immense, lonely man being struck down felt fundamentally wrong." He leaned forward, the firelight catching the silver in his black hair. His pale eyes held hers. The cold was still there, but it was a quiet cold now. The cold of a deep lake, not a raging blizzard. "When my wolf knelt to you," he began, his voice a low confession, "it wasn't just submission, it was a plea. It's been dying for so long, Colum, a slow, cold fade into nothing. And when you are near, the fading slows, the cold recedes, just a fraction. It's like feeling the sun after a lifetime of winter." He reached across the fire, his hand open on the stone floor between them. An invitation. "I do not understand the magic that flows in you. I do not know why the fates chose you, a girl a foolish pack threw away." His gaze was raw, stripped of all kingship, all power. It was just a man, wounded and afraid. "But my wolf chose you, and I am choosing to trust my wolf." He took a ragged breath. "I need you, Colum. Not as a queen for a throne, not as a vessel for an heir. I need you." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Need. No one had ever needed her for anything but menial labor. To be needed for who she was? It was a terrifying, exhilarating thought. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out her own hand and placed it in his. His skin was cold, so cold, but his grip was strong, and for the first time, she didn't pull away from the chill. She held on, her warmth against his ice, and felt a connection spark between them, fragile and new, forged in the heart of the fire. The return to the fortress was grim. Marius met them at the gates, his face a mask of concern and fury. Rogues! So close to the citadel. Unthinkable. I will have the perimeter patrols doubled, Your Majesty. This cannot happen again. Theron merely grunted, his hand still protectively on Column's back, as he guided her inside. The wound in his shoulder was healing, the fast regeneration of an alpha at work. But he looked drained. The brief warmth from the cave seemed to have vanished, replaced by an even deeper chill. In the days that followed, the fortress became a cage. Under the guise of protecting her, Marius restricted her movements. The walks on the battlements ceased. Her visits to the library were accompanied by guards. "The rogues are still out there, my lady," he would say, his kind eyes filled with worry. "We cannot risk your safety. You are too important now." The trust forged in fire between her and Theron flickered in the oppressive atmosphere. He was consumed by matters of state, by the hunt for the rogues, and by a growing visible weakness. The cold emanating from him was becoming more profound. Sometimes, in the middle of a council meeting, he would simply freeze, his hand clutching the arm of his throne, his face paling as if struck by an invisible blow. He tried to hide it, but she saw it. She saw the tremor in his hands when he thought no one was looking. She saw the way he would brace himself against a wall after rising, a faint sheen of sweat on his brow despite the unnatural cold of his skin. The fading was accelerating. "It's the bond," Marius explained to her one evening, finding her pacing in her chambers. "Forgive me for speaking plainly, my lady. The mate bond is forming between you and the king. But your own power is unawakened, dormant. The bond is drawing on his energy to try and spark yours, but it's like trying to light a fire with a damp flint. It's draining him." A cold dread washed over her. "I'm hurting him?" "No, no, my lady," Marius said quickly, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "You are his only hope. We just need to find the key to unlocking what is inside you. An ancient text, a ritual. I have the scholars searching day and night. We will find it. I promise you." His reassurance felt hollow. She was the cause. Her worthlessness was not just a failing. It was a weapon pointed at the heart of the man who had claimed her, the man who had said he needed her. She tried to talk to Theron, to ask him to sever the connection, to send her away, but he refused to see her. He locked himself away in his strategium, the doors barred. The messages she sent were returned unopened. He was pushing her away, and she feared it was because he blamed her too. The fragile connection they'd shared in the cave felt like a distant dream. The collapse happened in the throne room. A delegation of lords from the southern Pax had arrived, demanding answers about the rogue attacks and the king's stability. The hall was tense, the air thick with challenge and distrust. Theron sat on his throne, a figure of ice and stone. He listened to their grievances, his face an unreadable mask. Column stood near the dais, her heart pounding. He looked fragile, his skin almost translucent, the frost-colored eyes clouded with pain. Lord Vorlag, a burly alpha with a fiery red beard, stepped forward. "We have heard whispers, King Theron, that your wolf is gone, that the alpha line is broken, that you have taken a nameless stray as your mate, and she has drained what little strength you had left." A furious murmur went through the court. Theron rose slowly to his feet. A wave of cold so intense it felt like a physical blow washed from the throne. "You forget yourself, Lord Vorlag," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. I was addressing my future queen. The title-worthy line hung in the air, a shield for her. He took a step forward, and then he faltered. He swayed, his hand flying to his chest. A gasp escaped his lips, a plume of white vapor in the cold air. "Your Majesty!" Marius cried, rushing forward. Theron fell. He didn't stumble, he collapsed, his massive frame hitting the stone floor with a sickening thud. He lay still, his eyes closed, his face as white as the mountain snows. Panic erupted. The lords shouted. The guards scrambled. Column shoved her way through the chaos, her world narrowing to his still form. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his chest. His skin was not just cold, it was the cold of the grave. A deep, unnatural frost was beginning to creep across his skin, starting from his chest, a delicate, deadly filigree of ice. "He's freezing!" she cried, her voice choked with terror. Marius was there, his face a grim tableau of sorrow. "The curse," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's taken him. The bond. It was too much." He looked at Column, his kind eyes now filled with a terrible, pitying grief. His wolf has faded completely. She has taken everything. His words, though spoken softly, carried through the hall. Every eye turned to her. Accusation, fear, hatred. She was the curse. She was the blight. She had killed their king. "Seize her!" Lord Vorlag roared. "She is a witch! She has destroyed him!" The guards hesitated, looking from their fallen king to the grieving advisor, to the terrified girl. "No," Marius said, holding up a hand. "She did not know what she was doing. She is a victim in this as well." He turned to Column, his voice gentle but his eyes were cold, distant. "But they are right, my lady. Your presence. It is poison to him now. For his sake, you must be taken away." The world tilted on its axis. The one person who had been her anchor, her guide, was casting her out. His kindness had been a mask for this final, terrible judgment. The truth of her worthlessness had finally been laid bare for all to see. But as the guards reached for her, she looked down at Theron's face, at the frost creeping over his noble features, and a fire ignited in her chest, a defiant rage that burned away the fear. "No," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I will not leave him." She placed her hands on his chest, willing her own meager warmth into him, a useless, desperate gesture against the tide of deathly cold. She would not let him die. She would not. The vigil was a blur of cold and fear. They had moved Theron to his chambers, to the great bed where he now lay like a king on a funeral bier. The frost had spread, encasing his torso in a thin, glittering shell of ice. He was breathing, but each breath was shallow, a faint puff of vapor that immediately froze on the air. He was dying. Column refused to leave his side. She sat on a stool beside the bed, her hands wrapped around his, trying to force her life into his frozen limbs. It was useless. Her touch had no effect. The cold of his skin seeped into hers, leaving her fingers numb and aching. Marius had tried to have her removed, for her own safety, but she had refused with a ferocity that had surprised them both. "If he dies, I die with him," she had sworn, and something in her eyes must have convinced him, because he had retreated, leaving her to her hopeless watch. The court buzzed outside the doors. Factions were forming. Lord Vorlag was openly calling for a new alpha to be chosen, arguing that the line was broken. Marius, to his credit, argued for patience, for hope. But his hope felt like a performance. Every time he looked at her, his eyes held a deep, sorrowful finality. He was already mourning the king. She was alone with Theron. The fire roared in the hearth, but its heat couldn't touch the supernatural chill that filled the room. She talked to him, her voice a low, desperate murmur. She told him about her childhood, about the taunts, about the hunger. She told him about the ambush, about the flicker of trust in the cave. "You said you needed me," she whispered, her tears falling onto his frozen hand. "I'm here. Please, come back. Don't leave me alone." He didn't stir. The ice crept higher, touching his jaw. On the third day, Marius entered the room, his face grave. He was not alone. Behind him stood two of his most loyal guards, their faces grim. "My lady," he began, his voice soft, but with an undercurrent of steel she had never heard before. "This has gone on long enough. You are unwell. You need rest." "I'm not leaving him," she said, her voice hoarse. "I'm afraid you no longer have a choice," Marius said. The kindness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "The council has voted. For the stability of the kingdom, you are to be placed in seclusion until the succession is settled." "Succession? He's not dead!" she cried, her voice cracking. "He is," Marius said, his voice flat. "His body just hasn't accepted it yet." He nodded to the guards. "Take her. Be gentle." The guards moved forward. Column scrambled to her feet, placing herself between them and the bed. "No, you can't." As the guards reached for her, her eyes fell on a detail she had never noticed before. On the hilt of Marius's ceremonial dagger, a small, intricate carving was visible. A sigil. A twisted root, intertwined with a thorny vine. The world stopped. That sigil. She had seen it before. Long ago. It was the mark of the land trader who had come to her village. The man who had spoken quietly with her pack alpha. A man whose face she had forgotten, but whose cold eyes she never would. The man who had bought her family's debt, who had forced her father into a desperate contract, a contract that had ended with her family ruined and her cast out. It was all his fault. Her ruin, her exile, her presence at the choosing. "You," she breathed, the realization a physical blow. "It was you. You were the traitor." Marius stilled. The mask of the gentle advisor fell away, revealing the predator beneath. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. "Clever girl. I wondered if you would remember. Your father was a fool. He made a bad deal. I merely collected on it." "You orchestrated everything," she whispered, her mind racing, connecting the dots. "My pack. The auction. You wanted me here." "Of course," he sneered, stepping closer. "I have studied the ancient texts for decades. I knew of your bloodline, the dormant power within it, a power meant to amplify, to heal. I knew the king's wolf was fading. I brought you here, the perfect tool, thinking you would be a key to control him, a conduit for my own influence." His eyes glittered with fanatical light. "But you are flawed, defective. Instead of healing him, you've drained him dry. You have accelerated his demise and ruined all my plans." He gestured to the frozen king. "But no matter. With him gone, and you discredited as the witch who killed him, the council will have no choice but to name a regent. And I have served this kingdom so faithfully." The pieces slammed into place. The rogue attack. It wasn't random. It was to test her, to throw her and Theron together, to force the bond. His helpfulness. It was all manipulation. He wasn't a trusted ally. He was the villain, the architect of all her pain. "He's not dead," she snarled, a rage unlike anything she had ever felt surging through her veins. It was hot, a furnace in her chest, burning away the cold of the room, the cold of her own despair. "He is," Marius spat, his patience gone, "and you will be a footnote in the history of his tragic reign. Seize her." The guards grabbed her arms. Their touch was rough, their faces impassive. They started to drag her away from the bed, away from Theron. She fought, but she was weak. They pulled her toward the door. She looked back at Theron's still form, at the ice now covering half his face. Despair crashed over her. She had failed him. Marius had won. Marius walked over to the bed and looked down at the king, a triumphant smirk on his lips. He drew his ceremonial dagger, the one with the twisted root sigil. "A shame," he murmured. "He was a great king, but his time is over. A clean end is a mercy." He was going to kill him, to finish the job. No! The scream was ripped from her very soul, a sound of pure, primal negation. Something inside her broke. A dam of grief and rage and a fierce, impossible love shattered. It was not a thought. It was not a choice. It was an eruption. A wave of golden light exploded from her body. It was not fire. It was pure life, pure warmth, pure power. The light slammed into the guards holding her, throwing them back against the wall where they crumpled, unconscious. The room, which had been unnaturally cold, was instantly flooded with a profound warmth, like the first day of spring after a brutal winter. The furs on the walls seemed to brighten. The very stones seemed to sigh in relief. Colum stood untethered, her body thrumming with an energy she didn't recognize. The thin, worthless shift she wore seemed to glow. Her hands, once chapped and cold, were now radiating a soft, golden light. She felt whole. The hollow space inside her was gone, filled to bursting with this incredible power, her bloodline. It was awake. Marius stared, his face a mask of utter shock and terror. "Impossible. You were dormant." "You thought I was a tool," she said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a clear, ringing bell of authority. "You thought I was worthless." She raised a hand, and the light coalesced around her fingers. "You were wrong." She didn't look at Marius. She looked at Theron. The power in her wasn't for vengeance. It was for him. It had always been for him. She turned back to the bed, ignoring the trembling advisor. She placed her glowing hands on Theron's chest, directly over the lattice of ice. The moment her palms touched him, the golden light surged from her into him, a river of pure life pouring into a frozen wasteland. The ice didn't just melt, it sublimated, vanishing into mist with a soft hissing sound. The deathly pallor of his skin was replaced by a healthy flush. The cold that had clung to him for a decade was burned away in an instant, and from deep within his chest, a new light began to glow, a fierce, silver counterpart to her gold. A sound echoed in the room, a sound no one had heard in 10 years. It was the howl of a wolf. Not a spectral, pained echo, but a full-throated, triumphant cry of return. It came from inside Theron, from his very soul. His eyes snapped open. They were no longer the color of winter frost. They were molten silver, burning with the restored fire of his wolf, a fire that was now intertwined with threads of pure gold, her gold. He took a deep, shuddering breath, not of a dying man, but of a man reborn. He looked at Colum, at her hands on his chest, at the light that connected them. He saw her, not as a stray, not as a healer, but as the other half of his soul. "Colum," he breathed, his voice rich and full of life. Then his silver-gold eyes shifted, finding Marius cowering by the wall. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. The warmth of Colum's magic remained, but it was now laced with the king's arctic fury. "Marius," Theron growled, sitting up. The power rolling off him was immense, 10 times what it had been before, amplified and perfected by Colum's own. "You have much to answer for." The reunion was not in the quiet of a cave, but in the thunderous silence of the throne room. Marius, stripped of his titles and his dignity, had confessed everything. His plots, the rogue attack, his plan to seize the regency. He had been so sure of his victory that Theron's return had shattered his sanity. Lord Vorlag and the other nobles stood in stunned silence, their gazes shifting from the restored, incandescent king to the small woman who stood beside him. She was no longer in her simple shift. She wore a gown the color of midnight, but it was her presence, not her clothes, that commanded their attention. The golden light had receded, but a faint aura of it still clung to her, a quiet hum of power that every wolf in the room could feel in their bones. Theron sat on his throne, not as a figure of ice, but as a living embodiment of power. His hand rested on columns, their fingers intertwined. His skin was no longer cold, but warm, a steady, living heat that seemed to flow into her. The spectral wolf was gone, not vanished, but reintegrated. He was whole again, because of her. Ware, Lord Marius of the fallen house root. Theron's voice rang out, each word a hammer blow of judgment. For treason against the crown, for the attempted murder of your Alpha, and for crimes against the innocent of this kingdom, you are hereby sentenced not to death, but to the silence. Marius looked up, his face wild with terror. The silence was a fate worse than death, to have one's wolf magically severed, to be cast out into the wilderness, a man with no pack, no instincts, no soul. A true nothing. As the guards dragged Marius away, Theron stood, pulling Column to her feet beside him. He faced the assembly, his silver-gold eyes sweeping over them all. "You have witnessed a great many things today," he said, his voice resonating with a new warmth. "You have seen betrayal, and you have seen loyalty. You have seen death, and you have seen rebirth." His gaze softened as he looked down at Column. He raised her hand, the one intertwined with his, for all to see. "My wolf did not kneel to a healer," he declared, his voice ringing with pride. "It did not submit to a convenience. It recognized its other half. It knelt to its queen." He turned to her, ignoring the hundreds of watching eyes. He cupped her face with his free hand, his thumb stroking her cheek. The gesture was so tender, so full of reverence, it made her heart ache. "They called you worthless," he murmured for her ears only. "They were fools. You are the most valuable soul in this kingdom. You are the fire that brought back the sun." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "I love you, Column. I think I have from the moment you stood in that ring and pitied my monster instead of fearing it." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of a love so profound it felt like the very power that now hummed in her veins. "I love you," she whispered back, the words as natural as breathing. She was not worthless. She was loved. By a king. By a man who she had saved, just as he had saved her. He smiled. A true, breathtaking smile that was like watching a sunrise after 100 years of winter. It lit up his entire face, chasing away the last of the shadows. "Then come and take me," he whispered, a title-worthy line of perfect surrender and invitation. Before the entire court, before the lords who had scorned her and the pack that had misjudged her, the Alpha King lowered his head and kissed his queen. It was not a kiss of possession, but of partnership. A seal on a bond not of magic, but of two broken souls who had found their way back to wholeness in each other. 6 months later, the mountain fortress was a different place. The oppressive chill was gone, replaced by a tangible warmth that had nothing to do with the fires in the hearths. Laughter could be heard in the corridors. Bright tapestries depicting a golden sun intertwined with a silver wolf now hung on the walls. The court was no longer a place of fear, but of vibrant, hopeful life. Column stood on the balcony of their chambers, looking out at the snow-capped peaks gleaming in the morning light. The heavy robe she had once clung to for warmth was gone, replaced by a simple dress that was comfortable and her own. She was no longer a stray huddled in a king's shadow. She was a queen who stood beside him in the sun, strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar, beloved warmth pressed against her back. Theron rested his chin on her shoulder, his hand coming to rest on her still flat stomach. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "I was thinking about the first time I came here," she said, leaning back into his embrace. "I was so scared. The stones were so cold." "And now?" She turned in his arms, looping hers around his neck. She looked into his eyes, the silver and gold now a perfect, harmonious blend. "Now they feel like home?" His smile still made her breath catch. He had learned to smile easily, especially when he was with her. "It was never the stones that were cold, my love. It was me. You warmed the stones because you healed the man." She felt a familiar flicker of power, a gentle pulse of gold from her heart that met an answering pulse of silver from his. Their bond was a living thing, a constant, quiet song beneath their skin. Her power had not just restored his wolf, it had merged with it, creating something new, something stronger than either had been alone. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly, her hand coming up to trace the line of his jaw. "The bond? Any more?" He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. He looked at her, his expression full of a love so deep it was bottomless. "Not anymore," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Then he grinned, a flash of the predator he still was. "Liar," he added, mimicking a past exchange, making her laugh. The old pain was a ghost they could now jest with. He pulled her closer, his gaze turning serious again. "My life began the day you walked into that ring, Colum. Everything before was just waiting." She knew what he meant. Her own life had been the same, a long gray period of mere survival. Now she was living. They were building a new world together, not on foundations of power and fear, but on trust, partnership, and a love that had stared into the face of death and refused to back down. The kingdom was secure. Their people were thriving. And here, in the heart of the mountain, a new life was just beginning to stir, a tiny spark born of gold and silver, of fire and ice, their future. He bent his head, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was both familiar and new every time. It was a kiss of peace, of promise, and of a home found in the most unlikely of places. The world outside could bring what storms it would. Here, in his arms, she was finally, completely safe. Here, she was finally, completely herself.